America's Future Leaders, Climate Change Impacts, Education, and Vulnerability. Moderator for this session is one of the most dedicated, hardworking experts I know. His name is Dr. Leif Rosenberger, and he's been an excellent mentor to me for many years. Over the past several months, his efforts and advice in developing this conference has been invaluable. Could not have done it without him. Currently, he's the adjunct scholar at the Modern War Institute at WestPoint and also adjunct professor at International Political Economy in the Graduate School of Public and International Affairs at the University of Pittsburgh. He retired from the US government after 35 years of service in March 2016. During this time, he was chief economist at US Central Command in CENTCOM or US Pacific Command, PACOM, for almost 20 years. And here's Leif.
Well, thank you, Paul, for those kind words. I want to welcome everyone to the panel on educating America's future leaders. In many ways, this is a WestPoint panel. I'm enjoying my year as a visiting scholar here in the Modern War Institute at WestPoint. Dr. Amy Richards in Richmond is a full professor of geography at WestPoint. Dr. Adam Kalkstein is also a full professor and the chair of regional dynamics in the Center for Language, Culture, and Regional Studies at WestPoint. And actually, I was once a full professor at the Army War College, but that was many moons ago. And we also have Mark Reed, who of course opened the conference, and he is a full colonel and also the head of the Department of Geography and Environmental Engineering at WestPoint. Adam will speak first and talk about the science of climate change. Mark will speak second and talk about educating and training future Army leaders about climate change. And Amy will speak third and provide an analytical framework, as well as possibly some of her research on Africa. In our media event earlier this spring, some folks asked us, why does the US military care about the environment? Shouldn't the US military just focus on fighting America's wars? Isn't climate change a distraction? I respectfully disagree with this narrow mindset. Let me provide a context for this question. The day before the Syrian civil war began, a number of folks at CENTCOM and in the Pentagon were telling me, don't worry, be happy. Well, guess again, all hell broke loose the next day. Syria was stable and immune, they said, from Arab Spring, but actually it was not. So what did they miss? And why was there an intelligence failure? Let me put it this way. If a ballistic missile was launched somewhere in the Middle East, as we see happening every day in Israel, shared early warning systems would alert affected nations in the region while the missile was airborne. But if a country like Syria grossly mismanages their agriculture and national resources, and year after year makes itself increasingly vulnerable to climate change, which in turn leads to massive drought, food insecurity, migration, and social unrest, which Sherry talked about. Too many US officials in the past, like President Trump, turned a blind eye to these social and economic indicators of conflict and dismissed this sequence of events as sort of a quaint little humanitarian problem. Well, those days are now over at the Pentagon because Lloyd Austin is now Secretary of Defense. Now, why my optimism regarding Lloyd Austin as Secretary of Defense? Now, I have been a close friend of Lloyd Austin for a quarter century. Back in 1996, I was Lloyd Austin's mentor and professor in the same seminar at the US Army War College. And more recently, Lloyd was my boss at CENTCOM during our last 3 years in the US government. And I can assure you, he will not dismiss these leading social and economic indicators of military conflict and threat to human security. In fact, he has already made statements that connect the US military to environmental security, as Mark Reed mentioned earlier. Let me also put this in terms of war plans, since one of the questions was, should the US military just focus on fighting wars? Well, let's look at war planning. I worked a lot with the J5 in various combatant commands, and we worked a lot on phase 0 of war plans. And it's important for the US military to understand how environmental security is part of what former Secretary of Defense Bill Perry used to call preventive defense. And Sun Tzu used to say, you can win wars without firing a shot. But if war does break out, understanding environmental security will also help the US military readiness to be more successful to combat to be more successful in the combat arms phases of phases 1 and 2 in war planning. And at war's end, understanding environmental security will help the US military do its part in phases 3 and 4, which are stabilization and reconstruction. The US military will better understand how to create resiliency plans, as the general mentioned, for environmental security in post-war nation building. For instance, after a smokestack power plant gets blown up, you replace it with solar power driven power plants. You follow the best practices of countries like Morocco, which now has solar power driving half its electricity. This kind of nation building is exactly what my old boss, David Petraeus, and his 101st Airborne Division actually had in mind in Mosul, Iraq, back in 2003. With that context in mind, let me turn things over to Adam to talk about the science of climate change. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much. I appreciate the introduction. The goal of my talk here in the next 7.5 to 8 minutes is going to be really kind of separating the fact from fiction in climate change. It's not going to be unlike that 2-minute video that was shared at the very beginning of the conference today. After all, if we're going to adequately prepare for the impacts of climate change on security issues, we need to know exactly what those impacts are going to be. So with that, I'm going to share my screen with you. Right. Excellent. Okay. So just to give a quick overview, just to look at temperatures to begin with, again, it's kind of similar to that 2-minute video. Temperatures are increasing across the planet. This is very well established. The surface temperatures are increasing a little more rapidly than ocean temperatures. And over the past, 150 years or so, we're looking at an increase of about 1.5 to 2 degrees Celsius. That might not sound like much, but it actually is rather substantial because, the difference between nice conditions that we have today versus, a mile of ice over WestPoint is really only about 5 or 6 degrees Celsius. So 2 degrees Celsius is a substantial amount. So what's the reasoning behind this? Why are temperatures increasing? This shows carbon dioxide taken on Hawaii. I think, climatologists always love visiting kind of the most difficult places. Our trips are always to terrible places like Hawaii. So anyway, taken on Hawaii, you can see that carbon dioxide does continue to increase. And of course, this is due primarily to the burning of fossil fuels and industrialization across the planet. So why is this important? It's important because carbon dioxide, along with methane and other gases, they trap heat at Earth's surface. So if we're increasing the amount of these heat trapping gases, it makes sense that surface temperatures are also going to go up. So to just summarize what's happening with temperatures and the impact of humans on those temperatures, look, let's assume that you might be a climate change skeptic and you're going to dismiss that surface temperature record. Well, you could look at the satellite record or the weather balloon record, which also show warming trends, albeit a bit more modest. Or you could look at other branches of science that have reached the exact same conclusion. Look at flowering dates if you're into botany, or if you're looking at migration patterns in biology. If you're an oceanographer, look at surface ocean temperatures or sea level rise. So all of these independent branches of science have reached the same conclusion that surface temperatures are in fact increasing. Now, look at the bottom, are humans definitely doing this? That's kind of a tough call. We can say we are extremely likely with maybe 95 to 99% certainty, which is the definition here of extremely likely. In science, it's almost impossible to prove anything, especially because we know that climate has in fact changed on its own in the past. But look, the best evidence that we can have now is that we are really almost as certain as you can be in science that humans are, as a matter of fact, responsible for the present day warming. So now that we've established what surface temperatures are doing, I want to now go and talk about the impacts, because these could have some of the most profound impacts on security. So the first question I'm going to answer is to what climate change impacts might be on storms and severe weather. So this is actually a tough question to answer, and there are some kind of mixed results here with science. So first I want to talk about hurricanes, a topic that has already been mentioned throughout this conference. And this chart here shows the change in hurricanes across time. And if you look at both the blue, which are total hurricane landfall or total hurricane counts, and the red, which are major hurricane counts, you can see it hasn't changed appreciably over the last 30 or 40 years. And this is actually a kind of surprising thing, because we know, ocean temperatures are increasing and warm water is the fuel for hurricanes. But due to other factors like increasing wind shear and increasing dry air, the number of hurricanes has not changed appreciably throughout the period of record. But there's other stuff going on as well. So even though the number of hurricanes might not have changed very much, the rapid intensification and the overall strength of those hurricanes has increased. So to summarize, climate change might not change the number of hurricanes, especially across the Atlantic, but the storms that do form are likely to be stronger, reach into potentially new areas, and also potentially strengthen more rapidly, which could be very problematic. So it's kind of a mixed bag here, with, again, not necessarily more hurricanes, but potentially stronger hurricanes. Let's talk about tornadoes. If you look at the number of reported tornadoes across the United States, they are absolutely increasing in terms of reported tornadoes. A lot of scientists would love to jump at this and say, hey, look, it's climate change. It turns out, again, the actual story and the actual data, it's not quite that simple. As one example here, if there was a tornado that was occurring in the middle of nowhere, in the 1950s, it would likely go unreported. But now we have a lot of observers out there reporting any small swirl up as a tornado. In fact, I'm leaving with 6 students and our Air Force meteorology officer in just a matter of days on a severe weather observation trip across the plains. This is a picture from our last trip a few years ago. So to summarize, we now have more observers noting any landfall of a tornado. So there's going to be more reported tornadoes as a result. If we just look at the strongest tornadoes, the tornadoes that would have been reported in the 1950s and today, that increasing pattern entirely disappears. And this shows us that only the weakest tornadoes that would have not been known about in the past, that's the entire thing responsible for that observed trend. So to summarize, there is not much evidence that climate change is going to have a large impact on tornadoes. Moving on to flooding, which is the leading weather-related killer across the planet. Flooding has been increasing rather dramatically across the planet, but again, it's complicated. There's more urbanization, which increases runoff. People love living in dangerous areas as well, but there is absolutely a climate change component. With higher temperatures, we can have more water vapor in the air, and we do know when it rains today, it rains more heavily. So climate change is playing a role here, along with other factors as well. If you look at drought, the science here is a little bit mixed. I would say that most, but not all, scientists would argue that drought is likely to increase in the future due to elevated evaporation rates. And we have heard about this in the past, again, with the Syrian civil war, where perhaps climate change did, exacerbate that drought a little bit. I'm always hesitant to say it caused that drought, but perhaps due to elevated evaporation, it made it a little more severe. Heat is a topic I'm especially concerned with. Heat is the leading weather-related killer in the United States. We are likely to have more intense and more frequent heat waves across the planet. And again, recent heat waves in Europe and Russia have actually killed tens of thousands of people. So it's a very severe problem. Moving on to oceans, sea levels are rising. This is due to thermal expansion and also the melting ice caps, especially over Antarctica and especially Greenland, in fact. You can see sea level, it's rising, it's going up, it's rising by about 3.5 millimeters per year. You can do the math and plot this out, and in another 10 years or so, that's between an inch and an inch and a half of sea level rise. So, is lower Manhattan going to be flooded in the next 5 or 10 years? No, absolutely not. But when you start doing the math and moving further and further into the future, these coastal cities are more problematic. One more issue I want to mention as well is the fact that if you talk to many oceanographers, they're more concerned about the acidification of ocean as opposed to the actual sea level rise. And that's a huge potential issue down the road. If you look at sea ice, this is the floating ice in the Arctic. It is absolutely going down. This is a positive feedback loop. It continues to decrease. Antarctica, sea ice around that continent has been a little bit more steady over time, but in the Arctic, sea ice is absolutely expanding. Two last impacts I want to discuss before wrapping up are going to be the potential for potentially catastrophic events. I don't know about you, I saw the movie The Day After Tomorrow, right the day it came out. After all, look, usually it's the military saving the day. This was the climate scientist, the nerdy scientist who was jumping from ice sheet to ice sheet, saving the day. So I love this movie. Of course, it was pretty ridiculous in terms of the actual impacts, but you could potentially shut down currents, which could have major problems globally. The last potentially high impact event I want to discuss is the collapse of the Western Antarctic ice sheet, which is a portion of Antarctica, which is more susceptible to potential collapse. That could result over hundreds of years, an increase in sea level of approximately 4 meters, which could be very problematic, obviously. So to wrap it up, the impacts of climate change, I really think that future DoD documentation, and even here in this conference, I think we need to be very careful to be specific about what these impacts are of climate change that we're discussing. Right now, we know surface temperatures are rising. We believe that's due to human activity. And again, the impacts are potentially wide-ranging. Moving on, I just want to go off script for about 30 seconds here. Moving on through this conference, I do think we need to be careful about separating natural weather and climate variability versus a long-term climate change. I'm always very hesitant to blame individual events on climate change, whether that's an individual flood or a hurricane. I think it's safe to say that climate change would make these things worse, but it's hard to blame any specific event on climate change. And likewise, I never think that scientists should exaggerate the very real threats of climate change. We've talked a lot about perhaps the political right, bringing a snowball onto the Senate floor, which is not helpful at all. But we also have to be careful about the other side of the aisle, who has a tendency to potentially exaggerate these very real impacts. And by exaggerating, that's only going to hurt the credibility of this threat. So with that, I'm going to wrap it up. Again, I really appreciate it. And thank you.
Well, thank you, Adam. I really appreciated you striking that balance between people who are over-relaxed and call all of this a hoax and those who feel like they have to hype the threat. It's nice having somebody who actually looks at the science of all this and can put it in perspective. Now our next speaker is Mark, and he will talk a little bit about educating cadets in environmental security. Go ahead, Mark.
Great. Thank you, Leif, and thanks, Adam. As Adam said, we must always remember to return to the science of climate change and the impacts of climate change. It's very important that we use the very best, the most rigorous as we plan, educate, and train for the future. I'd also like to thank all of our conference organizers, a lot of people who put a lot of work in to pull this together, and I'm grateful for the opportunity to participate. There are many ways that the U.S. military and the U.S. Army have worked to educate and train our current and future leaders on a topics of environmental security and climate change. Before I go into examples, specific examples, I want to offer just a couple reminders. First, this is not something new. I mentioned in my opening that I've been studying this as both a soldier and a scholar for 20 years now. We can look back to the 2008 National Defense Authorization Act, which directed the executive branch, specifically the intelligence community and DoD, to conduct periodic assessments of climate change on national security. Specifically, it said, hey, look, DoD, I see you need to assess the risks of projected climate change to current and future missions of the armed forces, update defense plans based on these assessments, including working with allies and partners to incorporate climate mitigation strategies, capacity building, and relevant research and development, and develop the capabilities needed to reduce future impacts. That was back in 2008. Fast forward 10 years, the 2018 National Defense Authorization Act identified climate change as, quote, a direct threat to the national security of the United States. and is impacting the stability in areas of the world, both where the U.S. Armed Forces are operating today and where strategic implications for future conflict exists. And then several of our previous speakers today have highlighted some of the most recent strategic guidance within our Department of Defense. So we continue to see climate change security issues highlighted in our strategic level documents and guidance. How does that manifest itself in the force, specifically the education and training of our force? Well, I can't speak about the whole force. I can't even speak about all of the Army. That would take too much time. But let me provide a couple examples, and then I'll bring it specifically here to where I work at WestPoint. So in 2009, great example of using initiative on this. And it pains me a little bit as an Army officer to send kudos, not really, to my Navy brothers and sisters, but the Chief of Naval Operations, who's a senior officer in the U.S. Navy, formed Navy's Task Force Climate Change to examine the implications of climate change for national security, specifically in the realm of naval operations. They did some tremendous work over the period of years that they were in existence, and including a lot in research, education, and training in the force. A lot of great work, particularly in the Arctic, and used a science-based approach throughout. Another example, since at least 2015, climate change has appeared on the U.S. Army War College Key Strategic Issues list. This is a list that the Strategic Studies Institute within the Army War College publishes to inform students, faculty, and external research associates of strategic topics requiring research and analysis. This is informed by the Chief of Staff of the Army and other senior leaders, questions they want answers to. Specifically, the most recent KSIL asked, what are the potential impacts of climate change on the character of war, vital U.S. national interests, emerging security challenges for the U.S., and threats to soldier readiness? How could these impacts affect land power and the organization, training, and equipping of the U.S. Army? And then very recently in 2019, Army's Training and Doctrine Command published a new document called The Operational Environment and the Changing Character of Warfare, in which they identify climate change as an important driver affecting the operating environment, looking out as far as 2050. So these are just a few examples. There's certainly others. I want to spend my final few minutes talking about something that's near and dear to me as a faculty member here at WestPoint, charged with educating, training, and inspiring our future Army leaders. So each year here at WestPoint, we graduate and commission approximately 1/3 of the officers who are assessed into the U.S. Army, so about 1,000 cadets a year. Cadets at WestPoint undergo a rigorous 4-year program that includes a top-tier undergraduate education. Academic coursework includes a robust 27-course liberal arts core curriculum, and then each cadet selects a major on top of that for an additional 13 to 16 courses over their 4 years. All our graduates earn a Bachelor of Science degree. Approximately half of our graduates choose a major in the STEM disciplines, and the other half opt for a degree in the humanities or social sciences. Climate change and environmental stewardship are included in the curriculum in several ways. Again, I can't go into all of it, but let me give some example. First, all of our cadets take a core physical geography course during their freshman or sophomore year. The course includes blocks on weather, climate, landforms, and culture, and includes a lesson specifically focused on climate change. Climate is an important element of any basic geoscience curriculum and is also important in the context of the study of warfare, past, present, and future. As such, WestPoint has offered a course in climatology for decades and included a climate block in the core physical geography course for a similar length of time. This core physical geography course that all cadets take spans 30 lessons, 10 focused on weather and climate, one of which is solely dedicated to climate change. And that lesson was actually added as far back as when I was a junior rotating faculty member here back in 2004, because the faculty realized that it was an important, relevant topic, and an increasing number of cadets wanted to understand the basics of climate science and climate change. Additionally, several of our upper level courses taken by cadets majoring in many majors, but specifically geography, environmental science, include lessons or blocks of lessons on climate change. All of our environmental science majors take a capstone course called Environmental Security. That's their capstone course, during which they study many aspects of climate change, including the national security implications of climate change, both domestically and internationally, the relationship between energy and climate change, and the Paris Agreement. Cadets and faculty alike have opportunities to engage with the latest science and policy related to climate change through guest speakers, symposia, and conferences. Educating future Army officers about climate change remains an important part of preparing them to lead and serve in a complex, dangerous, and ever-changing world. I have a quote above my desk, and just to remind me that every day we prepare young men and women to succeed as warriors who win with honor in the crucible of ground combat. Outside my office right now, if you could hear, cadets, they've wrapped up the academic year, they've wrapped up classes. We're about to go through graduation of our seniors on Saturday, but the rest of them are headed off to do their summer training. Basic military, hard, challenging summer training. That's hugely important to what we do. But what we do here is we can train them hard in the basics of ground combat. We can also educate them for the complex environment that they'll enter upon graduation. So in conclusion, I'll just say that I'm an optimist. I try to seek opportunities in the midst of challenges. And as with any major challenges, climate change and environmental security provide opportunities for collaboration, for research, for learning, and working together to both adapt to change and to mitigate future risk. So with that, I'll turn it back over to Leif.
Thank you, Mark. With your leadership at WestPoint on this issue, I don't think we have anything to worry about. And I am glad you mentioned the Navy. I remember working at PACOM with Admiral Ruffhead when he was the deputy commander at PACOM, and as well as when he became the chief naval officer. And he's been also a promoter of green energy for the Navy. So I was glad there was no rivalry between the Army and the Navy on this issue. We're all moving in the same direction, which is nice to hear. So with that, I want to turn it over to our third speaker. And Amy will talk a little bit about coming up with an analytical framework, and if she has some time, to talk a little bit about her research in Africa. Thank you. Go ahead.
Thank you so much, and good morning to everybody. And thank you for asking me to participate in this conference with such distinguished speakers. My talk will focus on some of the research that I've done with cadets, exploring some of the topics that have come up this morning, and including how the environment influences stability and conflict. So security in the broadest sense, as we all know, is about all the things that we care about day to day. Are you safe? Can you feed your family? From this perspective, the military, perceived threats to security influence how the military prioritizes their missions, both here at home and abroad. So we teach cadets that environmental security includes risk analysis based on the understanding of complex interrelationships between humans and natural processes that could potentially destabilize the environment. Environmental stress alone does not trigger violent conflict. However, evidence suggests that it can enable violent conflict when it combines with weak governance and social fragmentation, typically along latent ethnic and political divisions. As Sherry Goodman and Joan van der Voort mentioned this morning, environmental stress can act as a threat multiplier. So to try and understand this better, we developed a framework which forms the basis for a narrative explaining links between environmental stress and conflict. I use this framework in the classroom, and it guides much of the research that I've done over the years with cadets. The framework suggests that environmentally enabled conflict evolves from 4 fundamental processes. These include non-sustainable practices, natural environmental changes, government activities, and also human activities. So these processes form the basis of our framework, but they're not mutually exclusive. They take place concurrently and occur at the intersection of the natural landscape and human activity. The same is true for the outcomes that we have identified, which include population growth, economic declines, government effectiveness, weak government conflict. So those are some of the outcomes that we have identified. But again, this framework is an analytical tool which can help identify areas that are a risk of environmentally aggravated conflict. So the framework is a good start, and it helps identify large-scale drivers and relationships. But using these concepts as a foundation, our research has increasingly focused on household vulnerability, because identifying household-level insecurity can help identify localized hotspots of insecurity. So to do this, we use an interdisciplinary model, and we attempt to understand the dynamic processes that drive vulnerability. And here we define vulnerability as the inability to withstand the effects of social or environmental changes. This research involved the use of widely available open source data to create an index, which was then validated in a series of fieldwork trips to Uganda, Ethiopia, and Rwanda, where we, and by we, it includes a team of WestPoint faculty and cadets, conducted over 100 in-person interviews to validate and contextualize the model results. We focused on sub-Saharan Africa because of the large number of failed or failing states. Pervasive political instability and lack of government control generally mean that these states lack the effective institutions and resources to mitigate the effects of non-sustainable practices that degrade the environment. They also struggle to safeguard the population from the effects of environmental stress. The methodology advanced in this research can examine household level drivers of vulnerability that are rarely accounted for in regional and global indices. So I'm going to try and share my screen. There we go. So this is an example of one of the heat maps that this type of research produced. This is for Uganda. The red areas are locations with higher level vulnerability, and the blue are lower levels of vulnerability. Many of the drivers creating those red areas of vulnerability are climate related. And our interviews in Uganda continuously highlighted the complex relationship between the environment and human well-being. Sustained environmental destruction of wetlands, deforestation, and lake contamination are some of Uganda's largest environmental threats. The largest vulnerable area in Uganda is the Karamoja district, which you can see in the north. Here, the dry climate, prolonged drought, violence, and food insecurity are combined to create a large population of highly vulnerable people. And although Kampala, the main city in Uganda, is relatively blue, 2 of the most vulnerable households are located here. So this finding and the increased acknowledgement that urban areas are growing rapidly and becoming increasingly and strategically important led further research to Uganda and then eventually to Accra, Ghana, to use the discussed framework in an urban environment. And so if we think that the urban environment is obviously important because over a quarter of the world's 100 fastest growing cities are in Africa. And by the end of the current decade, urban population is expected to increase in this region by 50%. So the region's cities exhibit high levels of poverty and inequality, and slums and informal settlements are growing rapidly. By their very nature, informal settlements exist outside of government control. And many of these most vulnerable neighborhoods within African cities are located on marginal land. For example, in Kampala, these neighborhoods are primarily located in wetlands, which flood frequently, as you can see in this picture. Working with local organizations, we were able to determine that the #1 priority for people living in these informal communities in Kampala is water drainage, followed closely by sanitation issues. So the rapid growth of these communities places considerable stress on these areas, resulting in an increasing number of people who are vulnerable to environmental disasters. So in conclusion, climate change is a threat multiplier, as we've heard this morning, or stress to the system. And our research here highlights how this can influence the local level. We were able to create heat maps showing the increased vulnerability where much of that vulnerability is driven by environmental change. We are currently researching leadership and governments in this informal communities. And this is important in this context because it is precisely these people who will be dealing with the effects of climate change. For example, it's this mothers group in Ghana that is on the ground focused on building these resilience in these communities. So especially as urbanization increases at such a rapid rate, this becomes increasingly more important. And finally, I would like to highlight that the involvement in cadets in this research has given them a very unique understanding of how the environment can and does influence human security. So thank you very much. That was a decade's worth of research in 8 minutes. So I'm happy to stick around for questions or after the conference as well.
Thank you very much, Amy. That was terrific. And one of the things that struck me as you were going through all this was, although you go into places like Uganda and other places you've gone, and in some ways each country is a little bit unique, but we're also seeing common patterns that seem to be happening in many areas of Africa, as well as in Syria, and I'm thinking of the Sahel and other places. So I think we have a common framework here, and I think we're indebted to Amy for creating that for us. Now, I wanted to turn this into the question and answer period. And I think I'd like to start with Adam. There are a few questions that are coming in here that I'd like to get your take on. One of which is, what solutions do you propose to help solve the climate change problem?
That's the million-dollar question. I think we've heard a little bit about this earlier in the conference. Obviously, with the need to focus heavily on renewables. My personal opinion on this is I do think, despite the risk, I think nuclear energy has made some tremendous technological strides over the last, decade or two. So I do look at nuclear as a potential great option. An important point I want to make is that early on in this conference, we were hearing that, we need to get everybody on board to help solve this problem. The way to do that is to lessen the impact on our day-to-day well-being, basically. So if we had to suddenly cut off, fossil fuels and everyone has to stop driving their, their pickup trucks and SUVs, people are going to be less likely to kind of get on the bandwagon here. So I look at nuclear as something where, look, we could have reliable energy with no real greenhouse gas emissions running 24/7. So the impact on our day-to-day lives would be minimal. So that is why I'm a large proponent of nuclear energy, despite the risks, is I think the impact on people would be minimized and we can maintain our lifestyles.
Thank you, Adam, for that. Another question coming in here, I guess it would be for Mark or anyone else who wants to take a crack at it. Does WestPoint conduct research related to climate change or environmental security?
So thanks, Leif. Yeah. So yes, but in short, and I think Amy, actually, I'm on with two of my fellow faculty members here who are great examples, and Amy provided a perfect example of that. Adam's done some outstanding work in the area of climate change impacts on human health. But let me say that up front, we are not a research institution. We're primarily a teaching institution. So our research capacity here is limited, and we always try. We do it. We need to do it to maintain our scholarly credentials. Our faculty are expected to conduct research in their disciplines. They often usually try to incorporate cadets in that to teach cadets how to conduct research, and they enjoy wide latitude to conduct research on their areas of interest and expertise as their time and priorities permit.
Let me follow that up. Is what I'm getting from you is that WestPoint will probably remain a place that focuses on undergraduate education and training. But do any of the graduates go on to graduate school and study environmental security? And how many seem to be interested in this?
Yeah, so absolutely, and I guess I'd be Exhibit A, right? So I went out, I commissioned into the infantry. Didn't really think I had a degree in environmental engineering. We graduate 1,000 cadets a year across all disciplines. Many go out and serve in combat support, combat arms, different branches. But then about their 8-year point, they had the option to go back to graduate school, earn an advanced degree. And that's where we see many. We bring in just in our department alone between 5 and 10 a year who have earned masters in a specific discipline. Some of those are related to the topics we're addressing today. That's what I did. I went and earned a degree focused on climate variability and change, and then came back and taught. So absolutely, there's a path to do that for our graduates if they so choose.
Yeah, we have a related questions come in, which is probably Amy could take a swing at this. what are the major lessons in environmental security that you want cadets to know, even if they don't, do what Mark has done and specialize in environmental security? But what's the takeaway that you would like them to have when they graduate?
It's a good question, and one that I'm always asking myself when I teach my classes. What is the one thing that I want them to remember? And I think for me, the most important concept is a way of thinking, and it's really embracing a systems approach to thinking. So linking the environment to human activity. I think ecologists, environmental scientists are used to this, like ecosystems approach and understanding how everything's connected. Adding people to that is, I think, critically important, and understanding that everything is connected to everything else and everything is linked. And so that is extremely relevant when we're talking about environmental security. Drought will cause migration into urban areas. Urban areas will become, might not have the capability of dealing with that. People will move into these informal settlements, which are in marginal land. So understanding those connections, I think, is really important.
Great. Let me, let's probably have time for 2 more questions. Let me, okay, this one might be good for Adam. Do you ever get pushback from the cadets when you cover climate change? In other words, do any of them say in the last 4 years before President Biden took over, gee, President Trump says everything you're saying is a hoax, and he's President of the United States, the head of the armed forces? Isn't there sort of a disconnect here?
So that's a great question. We do have a very diverse student body politically, and I have had a little bit of pushback. I always hate to group this into politics, but I would say I've had cadets on both sides of the political aisle push back at me at various times. Some think I'm going too far in describing the risks of climate change, where others argue I'm not going far enough. So I usually look at that as a sign that at least I'm doing a decent job. I think when I have both sides mad at me, I look at that as a success, quite frankly. So I have had a little bit of pushback, interestingly, on both sides, as a matter of fact.
Okay, this is probably time for our last question. We have about 2 or 3 minutes. Why don't we throw this at Mark? You stated that climate change is taught to cadets as part of WestPoint's curriculum. Some people might want to know who actually makes these decisions of what is actually included in the curriculum at WestPoint. How do they decide how much emphasis goes for environmental security as opposed to other issues?
Yeah, great question, Leif. Thanks. So we're really much like any institution of higher learning in that regard, at least. So we have senior faculty, like the ones who joined me on this panel, who are experts in their discipline. They're charged with keeping our curriculum up to date. They do that in a bunch of different ways. We have external accrediting bodies like the Middle States Commission on Higher Education. ABET reviews all our engineering programs, assesses those. We just went through those actually this year in the pandemic. That was kind of interesting. But they assess us, they advise us. We do periodic, about every 5 years, 6 years, we do a top to bottom review of our curriculum. We benchmark against other top tier institutions of higher education. And we have a pretty rigorous internal curriculum committee to review the process. In fact, coincidentally, Adam here is the chair of that curriculum committee, at least for a little while longer. And he's done an outstanding job of it. So, really the same that you hear at most other institutions. Is there anything that Adam doesn't do? I don't know. I haven't found it yet.
Unfortunately, that I think is time for our last question. I want to thank Adam, Mark, and Amy for stimulating presentations, as well as the audience for some questions. I wish we could answer all of them. They're piling up here, but if I'm not mistaken, it's time for lunch. And I want to again to thank you all. And I know one thing, I didn't have breakfast, so I'm anxious to get a little lunch. Thanks so much. Bye-bye.
Thank you.